I'm Sarah, and I'm here to talk a little bit about American business culture. So, where we are in the journey, we're still super early. You're probably preparing right now before classes even start, and that's fantastic. You'll use all of this knowledge later on when you begin to speak to folks about jobs, when you begin actually applying for jobs, and then interviewing and hopefully negotiating that final offer. This will be applicable to both your internship search and your full-time search. So listen up, we're about to start. So why are we talking about American business culture in the first place? This is super important. Many international candidates are passed over for job opportunities, not because they aren't skilled, but because of something called culture fit. So what do we mean by culture fit? There's a famous quote in Silicon Valley that is, hire for culture, train for skill. Culture fit means the actual culture and the way that people interact with each other inside of any company or office. However, this is strongly influenced by national culture. By knowing a little bit about American business culture, you'll be able to avoid the fate of losing a job opportunity simply because you didn't fit in with the culture. So arm yourself with this knowledge now, practice while you're on campus, and you'll be an ace by the time you start interviewing. All right, here's our first American culture trait. Americans are ultra direct. If we start to look at this chart, you can see a spectrum of low context to high context cultures. Low context cultures are incredibly direct. This comes from American history. It's a fairly young nation, and it's built of immigrants. When most Americans come over, a lot of them don't speak English, and that's been the case throughout our entire history. Some speak with different accents, some come from other different cultures. It's a huge melting pot, and that's beautiful, and it's also a challenge. So as a result, the US evolved as an incredibly direct culture. Because people weren't coming from the same place, we have to be very explicit about what we're saying, and it's often said over and over again. A great example of this, something that's quite normal in American business meetings, is to say the same thing multiple times in different ways, and then to follow up on that meeting with meeting notes assigning responsibilities to everybody and being ultra explicit about what happened during the meeting, recording it. Now, if you look on the other side of the spectrum, there are several cultures here which are high context. These cultures imply certain things, and it's not necessarily explicit that thing would be done. Looking at the other end of the spectrum, we've got a couple of high context cultures here. In high context cultures, it's sort of assumed that you say one thing and it might imply some other meanings. Americans don't understand this. So best advice for some American business meetings, and this, when I say business meetings, we can include anything from informational interviews to meeting a recruiter for the first time to doing that final interview. Pay more attention to the verbal cues that Americans are sending. They are saying exactly what they mean. A lot of the body language that accompanies these verbal cues might be unconscious and probably doesn't hold much meaning. That's totally different to the way that you would operate in a high context culture where some of the other cues, not the direct verbal cues, are super important. When interacting with Americans, also remember that they may not be able to understand if you're subtly hinting at something. In order to get your message across, you'll need to say exactly what you mean. Let's move on to our next feature of American business culture. This is another framework that we like to use called coconuts and peaches. So what does this mean? Peaches are folks who come from cultures that are soft and squishy on the outside, they're super friendly, and then you get toward the core and you kind of hit a wall. This is definitely the case for Americans. Many foreigners are surprised by how outwardly friendly Americans tend to be. A Spanish friend of mine once exclaimed to me, "Americans are so nice. You move in, they bake you a pie, a whole pie. They bring it to your house, and then you never hear from them again." So he's describing a phenomenon that we think of as peaches and coconuts. And when you look at the opposite end of the spectrum, you get to the coconuts. These tend to be folks from colder cultures like Germany or Switzerland, where people are a little bit tough on the outside. It's difficult to crack through that first meeting or first couple of interactions with them. And then once you get in, they're super warm and super friendly. So when you come to the US, be aware that Americans are peaches. In the first meeting with someone, they might be more friendly than you would necessarily expect, but that doesn't mean that they're soft all the way through. You can have someone who's very friendly on the outside and quite tough when you get into their core. Here's another trap that international students often fall into when recruiting for jobs in the US. Interruptions in US business meetings are considered impolite, so this is just a slide to remind you to wait to speak. Many cultures are comfortable with multiple people speaking at the same time. I think of, for example, the Italians and the Spanish as a couple of cultures that do this really well. Americans are very uncomfortable with this. If you'd like to make a comment, try raising your hand slightly or saying a quick okay or a yes, some kind of affirming statement to break into the conversation. If the other person pauses, then it's your time to speak. In general, particularly in group meetings, Americans will typically pause and look around the room when they're expecting someone to respond to their comments. Some cultures, on the other hand, would like a more explicit invitation. So often, Japanese culture, for example, would wait to be invited to speak. Americans won't necessarily do that either. They're somewhere in between. So if there is a pause in the conversation, you're welcome to take it upon yourself to offer your opinion. Because American business culture tends to be quite flat, non-hierarchical, even if you were the newest person in the room, you're welcome to speak at that time. When meeting with Americans, you must be on time. We get so much feedback from our international students that this is a major culture shift for them when they move to the US. It applies to lectures that you're attending, it applies to group meetings, it even applies to social outings out. If you say that you're going to meet someone for drinks, let's say a classmate, you must be there on time. It's appropriate to be maybe 5 minutes late, that's acceptable. If you're more than 5 minutes, it's considered quite rude and disrespectful of the person's time. So this is a major culture shift again for folks who are moving to the US. I've heard recommendations from our students that they simply budget in an additional 30 minutes or 45 minutes, whatever it takes, to get themselves to the place on American Standard Time. When you're meeting with an American and you do arrive on time, there's almost always an agenda and it's typically followed. At the meeting, you'll have individual action items assigned to each person and usually someone following up with everyone in meeting notes via email afterward. The communication style, even in business, is generally informal. So interactions tend to be relaxed, friendly, sometimes spontaneous. Because of that, Americans rarely use job titles, and often they don't even denote job function. So if you call someone sir or madam, that's seen as overly formal, almost to the point of being rude. I think of it as you're implying that that person looks kind of old, like old enough to be your grandmother or your grandfather. So you would only say sir or madam to someone who is significantly older than you. Demographics like age, position in the company, rank, gender, they don't strongly influence communication style. So unless maybe you're speaking with a client, there's no reason to be super formal with Americans. Even when you're going in for job interviews, you can speak to the recruiter the same way that you would to your professor, or maybe to a colleague who's a couple levels above you. Also, when writing emails, it's fine to start almost every email with hi and the person's first name for anyone that you're introduced to, pretty much regardless of their title. For nearly everyone, you don't need to include dear or dear sir or anything like that. The only exception is that often when people write doctor in their title, with a surname next to it, it's appropriate to use that as well. So, one thing to think about when you're working on teams, both during your course and when you're at work. The only time that Americans aren't direct is when they're giving criticism or constructive feedback, as we like to call it. So, constructive criticism is done very delicately. It's the one critical exception to the rule that Americans are direct. The unwritten rule of criticism in the US is that you give 3 compliments for every 1 criticism. So, when performance is measured in a formal way, criticism is almost always done in a one-to-one setting. That means you'll be with your manager and they'll be speaking to you about your performance. Or if you're managing someone, same thing goes for your direct reports. It's really important to remember that if your manager is giving you 3 compliments and 1 critique, that's sort of a standard formula for you're doing okay. It's great to deliver this as well to the folks who might be reporting to you in the future. Another feature of feedback in the US is that 360-degree feedback, so feedback coming from your direct reports, your peers, and your manager, is super common. The focus on feedback in the US tends to be on the individual, and it tends to be on the work that you do, the specific tasks. So it's about individual performance on the task at hand. A little bit about body language, eye contact, and personal space when you're hanging out with Americans, both social settings and professional ones. It's great to maintain eye contact, particularly when you're speaking. It helps to actually look someone in the eye and deliver your message. Occasionally, you might want to look away. Americans prefer a decent amount of eye contact, but not staring. When you're listening to someone, it's okay to give a little bit more eye contact to show that you're really taking in the message. Personal space is also supremely important. This is something that a lot of folks who come from very close-knit cultures get shocked by when they come to the US. Americans typically stand 1 meter away from the person they're speaking to. For many of you, this will seem absolutely ridiculous. But you'll notice that if you are chatting to someone, even at an informal event or at a recruiting event, for example, if you start to edge toward them inside of that 1 meter, they'll usually back away slowly. And we've seen situations where you kind of end up chasing the person around. So it's super important for preparation for your business interactions that you kind of practice maintaining that 1 meter space. Now, as you become emotionally closer to someone, whether you become friends or maybe even partners and family members, that distance shrinks, of course. When you first meet someone, this personal space is pretty rigid for Americans. It's uncommon for people to touch beyond a handshake until they're really close friends. Now, there's one exception to this rule, which always perplexes our international students. Americans tend to hug very easily when they greet. So once you become friends with someone, even if friends means you've met them once or twice, they'll probably hug you next time they see you. Sometimes these are kind of air hugs, sometimes they're a little bit closer. So this is something which takes some international folks a little while to get used to, especially because Americans are not comfortable with cheek kisses the way that many Europeans are. So unless they're hipsters living in Brooklyn, probably don't cheek kiss them. They won't know how to handle that, but they'll try to hug you. So it's just something that takes a little bit of practice to get comfortable with. On to the next characteristic of individuality. Americans have a long history of autonomy and individual achievement. This still reflects in the business culture. So recognition is typically given to individuals for their accomplishments. It's changing slightly to focus on teams, but typically the team lead will take that recognition on behalf of the rest of the team. Autonomy and working on your own initiative are very strongly encouraged in American business. You'll likely see this reflected in your course as well. Professors will often give group work to, let's say, a group of 4 or 5 and not check in on anyone, maybe not even be super available for feedback or wanting to manage the team. They expect that the team will self-organize around the project and deliver it on time. Also, when you're running an autonomous project, change is viewed as a normal part of the process. In the US, it's not the case that you decide the whole plan up front and then follow that plan rigidly all the way through. Instead, you'll probably decide a general direction with your team and then, work loosely, everybody on his or her own assignment toward that goal. You'll have check-ins to kind of sync up and make sure that you're working in the right direction, but it's less structured than some folks tend to be, and maybe a little bit more structured than others. That said, a couple of other features of individuality which might be interesting to you as you start to work with classmates and later on with colleagues in the US. As we noted, Americans are very casual and individual, so first names and nicknames are super common. Bosses, managers often have an open door policy, and there's very free sharing of information. So that tends to happen in most offices, most businesses inside of the US. All right, so how do you test out all of these new culture cues that you're learning? Start in the classroom, for sure. You're about to go over to the US and meet a ton of Americans in your class and a whole bunch of international students as well who are assimilating at the same time that you are. So one way to do this in particular is to speak up in class. Because the classroom is your test lab, you'll be expected to act more or less as if you're in a professional environment. It's probably less professional than you would be at work. You likely won't have to wear a suit to class, for example. But it's still more professional than relaxing with friends. So start practicing some of these characteristics with your professors and your classmates. For example, your professors will probably ask you to address them by their first name. Also, as you use the classroom to test and learn, observe other people's reactions to your comments. So just have a little bit of empathy and take note how the Americans are responding to your comments and vice versa. Do remember, as you're going through class, that Americans usually enjoy the challenges involved with problem solving in a group. So very often class discussions will be about group problem solving, either in the whole group of the class or breaking out into pairs or smaller groups. So expect Americans to value the extroversion that comes along with live problem solving, change happening as it goes along, and being pretty flexible with that. Well, that wraps up our video on how to get ahead in American business culture. I hope this gives you a couple things to think about as you test some of these principles while you're in class and then later apply them to recruiting for jobs in the US.